And so I want to introduce you to a guy by the name of Alex Newman, worldwide famous, a journalist. He is an award-winning journalist, an educator, an author, and a consultant. Alex has written for a wide array of publications in the United States and abroad. He currently serves as a contributor to the Epoch Times, the World Net Daily, Freedom Project Media, the New American Magazine, the Law Enforcement's Intelligence Brief, and more. His bylines and writing have been featured in major newspapers and publications across the United States and the world. He has been featured many times on Fox, Newsmax, OAN, TBN, CNN, and all the other major talk shows. Alex has authored and co-authored several books and serves as a director for multiple organizations in the fight for faith, family, and freedom. And that's exactly what we're talking about here today. He has lived in 8 countries on 4 continents. He speaks multiple languages fluently and has been cited by governments and major news media outlets across the world. I can attest to this. He is a frequent speaker at conferences and churches across America and around the world, altogether having reached tens of millions of people with the message of faith, family, and freedom. Alex is married and has 5 children, and he currently splits his time between the United States and Europe. If you have a chance to meet Alex, this is the guy to meet. Brett explained it as bookends at this convention. This is the beginning of one side. This is going to be great. Please welcome Alex Newman, an American hero.
Thank you, brother. You're very kind. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. It is a great honor to be here speaking with you. And I'm going to try to put what's happening with the war on farmers into a broader context. But I'll start off by saying it's so great to be with the people who actually produce the things that we need to live. You know, we can live without politicians, and there are some fantastic ones here. We can live without bureaucrats. We can live without journalists. But we cannot live without the people who produce our food. And that's one of the reasons why this war on our farmers is so incredibly troubling. If these evildoers that I'm going to expose today get their way, none of you will be doing what you're doing today by the year 2030, and it will be a very, very different world. So one of the things that I've done as a journalist, and by the way, I do aspire someday to be like you guys when I grow up. I've got 1 cow, working on building a herd. True story. Once I get a few more, I'll get a cowboy hat, but true story. But I get to go around the world to these UN conferences, especially the climate conferences. And one of the guys that I've met there several times is John Kerry. He was the climate czar until recently. And just a few months ago at the UN Climate Summit in Arabia, he said something really interesting that's going to impact all of you.
Have no clue that agriculture contributes about 33% of all the emissions of the world, depending a little bit on how you count it, but it's anywhere from 26 to 33. And we can't get to net zero. We don't get this job done unless agriculture is front and center as part of the solution.
So they've got a big bullseye on your back. You make 33% of all the emissions. Oh no, and no mention of the fact that you also make 100% of all the food, which is kind of important. But this is where they're going. Now, they've already set the wheels in motion to engineer a food crisis, not just here, but around the world. And in fact, in other places, it's already started. Here's Joe Biden in a rare moment of truth.
With regard to food shortage, yes, we did talk about food shortages, and it's going to be real.
Yeah, it's going to be real, right? It's coming. Now, the UN has a website. I pulled this right off of their site, Hunger, and the benefits of world hunger. They say it's a positive value to many people. So hunger is good from the UN's perspective. And we're going to see a whole lot more hunger in the years ahead. In fact, as I mentioned, it's already started. Here's the Secretary General of the United Abominations.
The latest State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World report reveals the last 2 years have already seen a doubling of the number of people who are severely food insecure. We face a real risk of multiple famines this year. And next year could be even worse. But we can avoid this catastrophe if we act now. And as our meeting team reminds us, if we act together to craft bold and coordinated policy responses.
Okay, so we're already in a food crisis. It's going to get worse, but if you give all power and authority and money to the United Abominations, everything's going to be fine. Right? If you don't know this guy, Antonio Guterres, he's the Secretary General of the UN. Before taking over that job, he was the head of the Socialist Internationale, which actually traces its lineage directly back to Karl Marx. It's the largest alliance of socialist and communist political parties in the world. Many of their members have the blood of millions of innocent people on their hands. These are not the kind of people we ought to be taking instructions from. Now, I first figured out there was a food crisis going on, an engineered food crisis coming in 2012. And it started in South Africa. I used to live in South Africa. I'm very fond of South Africa. South Africa is not really a true country. It's a collection of nations all amalgamated under a communist regime. But when I saw in 2012 the president of South Africa singing "Shoot the Boer," by the way, Boer means farmer in Dutch and Afrikaans, saying "Shoot the Boer," this doesn't sound like a good idea. Why would you want to shoot the farmer? Here's the video that turned me on to what was happening. This is the president of South Africa talking about shoot the Boer. They translate Boer as white man, and Boer has, of course, become associated with the Afrikaner people, but Boer means farmer. This is on national television in South Africa. We're going to shoot them. And it goes on for about 5 minutes. So the cabinet's going to shoot them. And, shooting the farmers? Like, they tried that in Zimbabwe, and they ended up starving. What a stupid idea, right? But that was my first hint that something really fishy was going on. Now, Julius Malema, he was the head of the ANC Youth League at the time. The ANC is the Communist Party that governs South Africa in an open alliance with the Communist Party of South Africa. Here he is singing, "We're going to shoot the farmer." Again, national TV. All right, we're going to shoot the Boer, we're going to shoot the farmer. Again, what a dumb idea. That's why people go hungry so frequently in Africa. But this has already actually started. By 2012, there had already been a massive wave of brutal murders against farmers. They actually have a hill in South Africa. They call it Plaas Moorde. It means farm murder in Afrikaans. And you can see a picture of the hill. There are thousands of little crosses there. Each one represents a farmer who was murdered by communist terrorists. Some of them in the most grotesque fashion imaginable. I won't even describe to you the tortures that they do. They leave Bibles on them as a warning. It's just unbelievably horrific. Women, children, elderly. And by some estimates, 10% of the commercial farmers of South Africa have already been slaughtered. There was about 40,000. There's been at least 4,000 murders. Nobody in the fake news is talking about this. When Donald Trump tweeted about it, the fake media lost its mind. And so this was my first clue that something fishy was going on. Now, the top expert on genocide in the world, Gregory Stanton, he was actually founded Genocide Watch, and he was an anti-apartheid activist, so nobody can accuse him of being a racist. He actually said the South Africans were at stage 6 out of 8 on the genocide scale against the Afrikaners, who, by the way, produce all the food there. It's the most productive farmers on planet Earth. No offense to American farmers, but each one of them feeds, on average, 1,200 people. And he said they were already at stage 6 out of 8. 6 is the preparation and planning phase. Stage 7 is the actual slaughter. Stage 8 is denial after the fact. So this is kind of an important story, and the fake media wasn't talking about it. Here's Gregory Stanton talking about his findings. He says the South African government is directly inciting genocide against these people. So I started writing about that. And then I used to live in Brazil, too. I lived in Brazil for many years. And I started getting information from friends of mine, some of whom are in agriculture. They said, hey, the government's stealing all our farmland. They're saying they got to give it back to Indians who supposedly lived there hundreds of years ago, maybe. And this was really an incredible thing. You have this Indian agency called FUNAI, and they were wiping whole towns off the map. They were actually sending police and military forces in there, some of them wearing UN costumes, and forcing these farmers to dismantle their houses at gunpoint so they could be herded into the cities. I've got a lot of videos of this from the news down there. It's all in Portuguese. You didn't hear a word about this in the fake media in America. But here they are. They're literally wiping these towns off the map, seizing millions of acres of the best agricultural lands in the world under the guise of giving it. See here, they're having to destroy their own houses. It is absolutely atrocious. This was 2013, so about a decade ago. Now, one of the things that the Brazilian regime said, a Marxist regime, said that, well, we signed a UN treaty that requires us to give back all lands that were ever used at some point in the past by an Indian, and so we have to give this all back to them. We don't need Congress to approve because we've already approved the treaty. So Article 26 of this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which, by the way, Obama signed for us in the United States, says indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used, which, by the way, that would include almost all of South Dakota. The guy who was the special rapporteur on indigenous people, this guy right here, Anaya, he actually said the U.S. needs to give back all the land that Indians once used, including Mount Rushmore. True story. This was an official UN press release. Americans can't have that anymore. You got to give it back to the Indians. So I actually called up the Indian tribe that was supposed to be the beneficiary of this program in Brazil. That was the Xavante tribe. And I asked their chief, here he is actually giving a speech about this scam. He said, that's not our land. That has never been our land. He said to me on the phone, we're Indians of the Floresta, not of the Cerrado. The Floresta is kind of the jungle. The Cerrado is like these big grasslands that exist down there. And all these villages, these farming villages that were being wiped out were in the Cerrado. He said, we've never lived there. We're jungle Indians. We don't live there. They're not taking this land for us. Don't blame us. They said the same thing to the farmers. Hey, this isn't for us. Don't look at us. So why were they doing it, right? So here we have a trend. Then communist China. Here's an article I wrote in December of 2013, or June of 2013. The mass murdering dictatorship in China was determined to relocate 250 million peasant farmers into the cities. They were literally razing villages to the ground. They called it the National New Type Urbanization Plan. 250 million people were supposed to move into the cities, and it's hard to believe. People think I've got the wrong number. I don't. By the best estimates that we have, they wiped 900,000 villages off the map. Some of them have already been destroyed. Some of them are now in ruins. There's some where a few people are kind of living in the ruins. Almost 1 million villages, agricultural villages, wiped off the map by this murderous dictatorship. Then we saw Sri Lanka. More recently, acting on orders from the United Abominations, they banned chemical fertilizers, they banned modern agricultural technology. This was supposed to make everybody sustainable. And of course, it led to a massive collapse in the food supply and mass hunger. The president, he's a socialist dictator of Sri Lanka, said this created opportunities for innovation and it's going to make us more sustainable. He said this at a UN summit. Well, it didn't take long for the entire food production system to collapse, and what happened? You had a revolution. They actually invaded the presidential palace, the prime minister's residence, they're swimming in his pool, they overthrew their institutions of government. It did not end well. More recently still, we saw what happened in Holland. The globalist regime there decided that cow farmers, dairy producers, cattle producers, you guys are not sustainable. They determined that they had to get rid of 1/3 of all of the cattle producers in the Netherlands. By the way, the second most productive agricultural people in the world are in Holland. Their descendants are the ones who live in South Africa. And by the way, you could take a South African farmer, plop him right down in Kansas, he would fit right in. They are the closest cousins we have as Americans anywhere in the world, closer even than the British. They, like us, fought a war against the British for their freedom. They lost, we won, so it ended up a little different. But in Holland, they said, we're going to shut down, we're going to expropriate 1/3 of all the farms in the country. The second largest agricultural exporter in the world after the United States by value. Now, fortunately, they just had an election. There's the protesters there. They had an election, and so some of this now is being scaled back. A member of Parliament, Gideon van Meijeren, says this is a war on the agricultural sector. These are farms that have been in the same family's hands for centuries, passed down from generation to generation to generation, that the government was trying to expropriate. Now, you guys know probably better than anybody what's going on in the United States. There's all kinds of different pretexts to wage war on our farmers. Maybe there's an endangered desert tortoise on your land. Maybe a clean water. Maybe your pond is navigable waters, so we need to come in and fine you $50,000 a day. And I know a lot of ranchers who are facing this. I'm sure many of you in this room are dealing with exactly this kind of absurdity. The Bundy Ranch situation thankfully brought this to the public's attention. The Bundy Ranch was the last one of 52 ranches in southern Clark County. All the others had already been cleared out, bought out, destroyed. And the Bundy Ranch folks said, no, we're not going down. And because Americans from across the country showed up with firearms, they ended up having to back down. And they were all the convictions were thrown out in court. They were all free. But only because they resisted were they able to stay. And it all began, of course, with the Endangered Species Act. There's a desert tortoise here, and so you guys can't run your cattle on this land anymore. Forget the fact that your family's been using it since the 1800s. You can't ranch here anymore. Now they've got the SEC rule they're trying to pass. I'm sure you guys have seen it. They want emissions disclosure from all publicly traded companies. Well, how's a publicly traded company going to do an emissions disclosure unless they know how much emissions there were at every step in the production chain, which means all of you will have to keep track of your carbon footprint, which is where all this is going. Now, the global war on farmers is real, it is global, and it all goes back to the United Nations as part of a broader plan. Some of you have probably heard of Agenda 2030. The head of the UN General Assembly, when this was adopted in 2015, said it was the master plan for humanity. And I imagine God probably had a very good chuckle about that. But the head of the UN, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the time, said this was the Global Declaration of Interdependence, a direct assault on our Declaration of Independence. Now, if you really want to understand what this is about, Goal 10 kind of is the punchline. Right? We have got to have global communism. We can't just redistribute wealth now within nations. Now we've got to redistribute it globally. Okay? We have to have fundamental changes to the way we produce and consume goods and services. And if this is starting to sound like Karl Marx, good, because that's exactly where these ideas come from. How is the government going to control how goods and services are produced and consumed? By taking over the way goods and services are produced and consumed, of course. Now, so many of these, they have 17 Sustainable Development Goals, so many of them impact farmers and ranchers directly. Goal number 2 says we have to have sustainable agriculture, sustainable food production, and we'll get into the meaning of that little buzzword here soon. Goal number 6 says you have to have sustainable management of water, especially in agriculture. And of course, who knows better how to sustainably manage their water than farmers and ranchers, right? What farmer and rancher ever said, hey, let's waste a lot of water? Right? I mean, give me a break. The bureaucrats are going to tell farmers and ranchers how to be sustainable with their water? I mean, if you believe that, I've got a nice beachfront property in Kansas to sell you. Talk to me later. So goal number 12, we've got to have sustainable consumption and production patterns, especially in agriculture, and sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources. Goal number 14, we've got to get rid of marine pollution, which, by the way, comes from farmers, according to this document. Now, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, we'll come back to them. They're right at the center of all of this. They're based in Rome, literally led by a member of the Chinese Communist Party, which has murdered more people than any other government in all human history, about 100 million of their own people. What do you think they'll do to you if they get the chance? And this organization put out a document right before Agenda 2030 was ratified by all the governments in the world. It's called Building a Common Vision for Sustainable Food and Agriculture, Principles and Approaches. Again, brought to you by the Communist Party of China. They say we need dramatic restrictions on fertilizer, chemicals, pesticides, emissions, water use, and on and on and on. As an example for how we can do this, they say we got to get rid of excessive use of nitrogen, and we also have to stop the greenhouse gas emissions. So Peter Drucker, very important guy, not very well known anymore today, but he had this vision for making huge changes at the international level. He said, what you need is a three-legged stool approach. Now, the first leg of the stool, he said, is the public sector, in other words, governments. So every national government in the world has adopted Agenda 2030, the master plan for humanity. Leg number 2 is the private sector, the businesses of the world, and we'll see how they fit in. And then leg number 3 is what they call the social sector or the religious sector. And what we'll see is that each of these legs of the stool are now being constructed to bring about these dramatic transformations. How many have heard of the World Economic Forum? Or as Klaus Schwab says, the World Economic Forum, the founder of the World Economic Forum. So they actually became, in 2019, they signed an official strategic partnership with the United Nations to implement Agenda 2030. Their role, according to the strategic partnership, is to bring the businesses of the world, especially the big businesses, onto Agenda 2030. The World Economic Forum put out a press release about it as well. Now, the religious side has become more and more clear to me as I've been going to these UN climate conferences. Just a couple of years ago, I was in Egypt for the UN COP27. And right before it was hosted, this is the conference of the parties, the UN Climate Summit, the UN released this document. It was Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives. And they said that the evolutionary processes that created our current systems of ethics and morality are no longer adequate for the task of saving the planet. What we need, they say, is new moral codes. We need people to act according to new moral codes. So I had this document going to Egypt, and I'm thinking about this. What does this actually mean? Interesting. Well, I get there, and all these so-called religious leaders are preparing this big ceremony. They're going to walk to the top of Mount Sinai, and they have a new and improved 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments of climate change. I kid you not. Okay, this is actually a picture of the weirdo holding up the green tablets, the new and improved 10 Commandments. It was supposed to be hundreds of religious leaders were going to go up to Mount Sinai. The Egyptian government wouldn't let us all go for security purposes, they said. But they did the ceremony. First, they did a climate repentance ceremony where they're repenting to the climate gods for their CO2 emissions and stuff. By the way, CO2 is not pollution. CO2 is the gas of life. It's the gas you exhale. The idea that it's pollution is utterly preposterous, but that's what underpins this whole fraud. So after they were done with their climate repentance ceremony, they unveiled the new 10 Commandments, and then they ranted and raved about how we're sorry, Mother Earth, for the climate change damages we've done. And so I ran into the 4 organizers of this absurdity at the UN conference. True story. And I said, hey, can I have an interview? They said, oh, yeah, that'd be great. So I got them on camera for 45 minutes. You can go watch the whole thing if you're interested. But here's one of the things that they said to me.
All religions teach us to respect the creation that we have been given. And we've done kind of a terrible job of that. And so with a new kind of 10 Commandments of climate change, which are an addendum to, not a replacement for, the original 10 Commandments, and a third covenant that we're some kind of working on between mankind and creation, that we would refocus on those elements of the teachings from across religions that point us in the direction of fixing the problems that we've created so that life can thrive on this planet and so that we can build that proverbial kingdom of heaven here on earth.
So there you heard it. So that's me on top of Mount Sinai. Isn't that interesting? So we need people to act according to new moral codes. And then conveniently, we've got a new and improved 10 Commandments that we're going to use to build what he calls the kingdom of heaven here on earth. First of all, that's blasphemous. Second of all, it's utterly ridiculous. Okay? God gave us the original 10 Commandments. We don't need a new one. God gave us the Old Covenant, God gave us the New Covenant, and the United Abominations is not going to give us a legitimate New Covenant. But this is the kind of absurdity that these people talk about when they think Americans aren't paying attention, which most of the time we're not, unfortunately. There are virtually no real journalists who go to these summits. I can tell you from being there. I call it the cheerleading section. It's pathetic. They're like trained SEALs. So the UN has this religious alliance. They call it Religions for Peace. And in 2019, they met in Germany, and all of these religious leaders from what they say is all the religions of the world agreed human development must be organized based on the 2030 Agenda, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now here's the lady who is leading this clown show. Her name is Dr. Azza Karam. She is the head of Religions for Peace. Before taking over Religions for Peace, she was at the UN Population Fund, which, by the way, is the UN agency in charge of reducing the population of people on the planet. And here's what she says about the third leg of this diabolical stool from hell.
My name is Azza Karam, and I have the privilege and the responsibility of serving a worldwide movement of interreligious institutions, organizations called Religions for Peace. In case you do not know it, we think of it as the United Nations of Religions. The United Nations has member states or governments. Religions for Peace has member religious institutions. All religious institutions.
All religious institutions. I called my pastor. I'm like, hey, are we members? No. Oh, uh-oh. I guess we're not a real religion, I guess. Right? And that is ultimately where this is going. Anybody who doesn't want to participate in this absurdity is going to be labeled a hater, an extremist, a cult, a sect, whatever it is. They are doing this already. You can be any religion you want as long as you don't say that Jesus is the way, then you're good. Right? You can worship a rock, a tree, a plant, yourself, your money, doesn't matter. As long as you don't say Jesus is the way, you're good. So let's get to this sustainability term, because it actually sounds really nice. It's kind of like a Rorschach test. Everybody sees what they want to see in it. But the UN has been telling us what they're doing for about 50 years now. Back in the early 1970s, the UN brought everybody, all the governments together in Canada, in Vancouver. And they came out with the first document that truly enshrined the sustainability agenda. It was called the Vancouver Declaration, the Habitat 1 meeting. And they said land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures of the market. They said private land ownership, this is all in the agreement, is a principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth, and therefore it contributes to social injustice. They said public control of land use is therefore indispensable. It's another way of saying essential or mandatory. So that land that you're ranching on, that you're farming on, that you think is your land, oh no, not if these people get their way. Okay?
We've signed a climate...
Now, even more recently, in 1992, all the governments of the world got together and signed another sustainability agreement. It was called Agenda 21. How many have heard of Agenda 21? Wow, this is a very well-informed crowd. CNN's been whining that it's a conspiracy theory for about 10 years now. Don't watch CNN. It's like pumping raw sewage into your brain. But here's George H.W. Bush talking about the sustainability program called Agenda 21.
We've signed a climate convention on the importance of economic instruments and free markets. Were included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document and the Rio Declaration. Let me be clear on one fundamental...
So, it's a real thing. President Bush signed it on behalf of the United States.
The
leader of the Communist Party loved it too.
Act, as this is known, presents us with an opportunity to follow up on the important work of the Earth Summit to develop its blueprint, Agenda 21, for...
So they all love it, right? If you're not familiar with Agenda 21, the UN summarized this hundreds of page agreement as an array of actions to be implemented by every person on Earth. They said effective execution is going to require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. I mean, these are big changes. Now, Chapter 36 gives away their methodology. And of course, this affects farmers and everybody else. But brainwashing your children is the primary way they plan to get this through. They actually said education is indispensable, there's that word again, for changing people's attitudes. You can't have bitter clingers clinging to old-fashioned ideas like thou shalt not steal and private property and things like that, right? So they say it needs to include spiritual development. Here's the Agenda 21 book for children that the UNESCO, the UN Education Agency, put out. Basically, if you want to understand sustainable development, just take what God teaches in the Bible, flip it exactly upside down, and you'll understand where they're going. Here's a good example of this. You've got the, I think it's Hindu deities or something up there. They're very mad because the storks are delivering all these babies. And on the next page, it tells you why. It says, the earth groans every time it registers another birth. Well, what did God say? Be fruitful and multiply. Thank you very much. And I'm working on it. I got my 6th child arriving in about a month. Praise the Lord. And it's a good start. But why would you tell kids that Mother Earth is groaning every time you have a baby? What kind of absurdity is that? The Bible says children are a blessing. Right? Why would you teach this to children? It's abusive and ridiculous. But this applies to every single issue every time. Now, the UN's got what they call a world core curriculum. They say it should be taught in every school to every child on Earth. It was written by this guy here, Robert Mueller. And he says in the teacher's manual, in the foreword, that it's based on the teachings of Alice Bailey and the Tibetan teacher Javal Kuhl, which is interesting. Alice Bailey was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. True story, absolutely true story. It's still around today. They call it the Lucis Trust. And that Tibetan teacher is not a Tibetan or a teacher. Alice Bailey claimed to be communicating with spiritual entities that she called ascended masters. If you've read your Bible, these are demons. But that is what, according to the guy who wrote it, the father of global education, the World Core Curriculum is based on. Now, if the World Core Curriculum is based on Alice Bailey, and the guy who wrote it says it is, we ought to know what Alice Bailey said. I've got her books in my library for research purposes. Education in the New Age is one of her books. She says we need world citizenship and a world brain. We're going to get this by fusing Marxism and neo-scholasticism using the methods of John Dewey, the founding father of America's public school system. Isn't that interesting? Now, some of you have probably heard of Common Core. Well, in 2004, Bill Gates of hell went to UNESCO headquarters in Paris and signed a deal with them to create global education standards, global curricula, global teacher training programs, so all the teachers would teach the same stuff. And then he came back to the United States and started pouring millions and then billions of dollars into Common Core,
States have
which, by the way, is being taught in all of the states. I don't care if your state government rebranded it. What they did was they copied and pasted it, 95%. They said Indiana state standards, Georgia state standards. It's all the same thing. Okay. And they bought ads to tell you how great this was going to be. These are their ads, right? This isn't Alex Newman telling you. This is them buying ads to tell you how great Common Core was going to be.
States have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. The standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too. Now we
They
know
match
how
up
we're doing
against
compared to just
international
about
standards
everyone.
too. So now we know how we're doing compared to just about everyone. Seattle, Chicago, Shanghai, Paris, all the little future slaves will learn the same thing. So their goal is a totalitarian one-world political, economic, and religious system. They're saying it now openly. They have come out of the closet. They just won't tell you on the front page of your newspaper. That means we have to wipe out the independent food producers. We have to wipe out the independent energy producers. We have to wipe out the small businessman, the independent creators of wealth, the landowners, the property owners, and bring it all together under this global system where the big corporations and the big government will dominate every area of our lives. You've probably heard of some of this. They call it the Great Reset, the New World Order. And of course, food will be a critical weapon in this. And Henry Kissinger, who was recruited, by the way, by David Rockefeller, who was recruited by Satan, so you see the kind of chain of command. And by the way, Klaus Schwab was recruited by Henry Kissinger. All this is true. Back in the 1970s, when he was serving as a National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, he put together the National Security Memo 200. And you can read this. It's been declassified, where he said, we have way too many people in the world. We need a lot less people in the world. And one of the ways we can advance this cause is by using food as a weapon. We will give more food to governments that sterilize people, that control the population of their countries, and we will use that food as leverage to get people to stop having so many babies. Again, what did God say? Be fruitful and multiply. Until you get to 7 billion, and once you get there, then you stop. And no, he didn't say that, right? So they have an agenda to depopulate the world, and they understand that food is a weapon to do it. And so you got the Rockefellers transforming food systems. You should read this report. It will give you an inkling of your future if these megalomaniacs are not stopped. The World Economic Forum has the food innovation hubs. Right? Now, Bill Gates of hell has been pretty clear that you guys and your cows, you've got to go. Here he is on one of the fakest of the fake news networks.
One crucial part is agriculture, and one thing you said you were particularly surprised by was how great a problem bovine flatulence is. Do you want to explain what that is and why it's a problem?
Yeah, so the
It'd be funny if it wasn't so
animals
insane.
that can eat grass have very unusual stomachs that have these bacteria that are methanogenic in there, and so they leak natural gas both out the front and the back. And so people have said, well, let's change the hay or throw some things in there.
That's what U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack told us last year on the Arabian Peninsula. We'll just give them new food additives.
Get cows to stop farting.
Exactly.
But Bill Gates says no, that won't work.
And so there is artificial meat, but that's at a very early stage. But that's another big source of greenhouse gas emissions. So, you know, I'm just trying to make sure that the people who acknowledge the problem, which I think is fantastic, that they understand the breadth of innovation required before you can get anywhere near what we have to do, which is zero. If it was a 50% reduction, then you could ignore, okay, leave the cows alone. But
Sorry, guys, it's got to go to 0. Okay. So one of the ways we can do that is make you eat the bugs. True story. Okay. Back in 2013, I wrote this article. People said, that can't be true, Alex. Don't be silly. Well, I had the UN report saying we're going to make the people eat the bugs. This is the report right here. Edible insects, right? It came out of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. They say cows make too much emissions. Fish is bad for the ocean. We could just have people eat bugs. That'll be better and healthier for them. And now, of course, they're promoting this openly. Here's the World Economic Forum telling you how great it'll be to eat the bugs for the planet. Okay. Yummy. And it goes on and on, right? It's good for you. It's rich in protein. Yeah, cockroach soup. Here we go. So here's the fake media, tax-funded propaganda, PBS.
By science.
All right. Oh, it's science.
Research helps
You got to
bring
trust the science.
unexpected ingredients to the table.
Kind of tastes like shrimp.
They have this seafood quality to them.
It reminds you.
It's kind of like lobster, right? The cockroach of the sea. So they're brainwashing kids to believe this stuff. Even in Florida, this was sent to me by parents of a fifth grader. This is what they're teaching my kids, that bugs are sustainable, cows are not sustainable. And the U.S. government knows how bad these are for you. In 2017, they funded a study. They found that eating the chitin in bugs causes innate immunity to generate a deluge of inflammatory cytokines, which injure organs, leading to asthma, atopic dermatitis, and in persistent situations leads to death, multiple sclerosis, cancer, systemic lupus. It sounds delicious, right? This is what the government knows the bugs are going to do to you, and yet they're still pushing it. Now, Bill Gates of hell has another idea. He published this article about gene editing for good. It says we need to genetically engineer everything, all our crops, all our livestock, even our babies. That's going to make us more sustainable. You know what else that's going to do? It's going to allow people like Bill Gates to own the patent on the organisms that we need to survive. Anybody think that's a good idea? No. See, he understands. His dad was a patent attorney and also on the board of Planned Parenthood, the largest butcher of unborn babies in America. They understand that if you can own the intellectual property, you control everything, including the farms and the ranches. Okay? And by the way, I wouldn't trust Bill Gates to clean a toilet bowl, much less genetically engineer my babies or my food. One of the reasons why is a talk he gave about 10 years ago talking about getting rid of people.
First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
If we do a really good job on abortion and vaccines, we can reduce the population by 10 or 15%. What? Pretty interesting. Now, they are hacking the software of life. They're pretty open about this. This is the chief of science at Moderna.
We've been living this phenomenal digital and scientific revolution. And I'm here today to tell you that we're actually hacking the software of life and that it's changing the way we think about prevention and treatment of disease. So here's all the biology you need to know in 30 seconds. Our body is made out of organs. Our organs are made out of cells. And in every cell, there's this thing called messenger RNA, or mRNA for short, that transmits the critical information from the DNA, our genes, to the protein, which is really the stuff we're all made out of. This is the critical information that determines what a cell will actually do. And so we think of it like an operating system. And it's not just in every cell of our body, it's actually in every cell of every organism alive. It's the same.
All right, woohoo, right? Now, the Great Reset, you've probably heard of it. Here's Klaus Schwab.
The COVID-19 crisis has shown us that our old systems are not fit anymore for the 21st century. Now is the historical moment, the time, not only to fight the real virus, but to shape the system for the need for the post-corona era.
Yeah, so I cannot imagine why they chose this guy to be the front man for this agenda, but nevertheless.
But we have another choice. We can build a new social contract, particularly integrating the next generation. We can change our behavior to be in harmony with nature again. And we can make sure that the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution are best utilized to provide us with better lives. In short,
we need a great reset. Right. Just give the guy a little mustache and it's perfect, right? So they've got 8 predictions by 2030. This comes from the World Economic Forum. And by 2030, if these monsters get their way, you will own nothing and you'll be happy, okay? But you're gonna have to rent everything. So somebody's gonna own stuff. It just won't be you, okay? Now, we used to call this system feudalism, which incidentally is exactly the type of global system they want. They own everything. You get to occupy a little piece of land and you get your food rations as long as you behave. He's actually outlined what this global system looks like. And ultimately, they want to end up with what they call the New World Order, or as Klaus Schwab says, the New World Order.
Dr. Kissinger, our time, our satellite time is running out. What wonderful opportunity to conclude our week here with such concrete proposals and ideas of how we can really create, I would say, a new world order.
Yes, a new world order, and Henry Kissinger.
Order can be created.
A new world order can be
We have
created.
before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations.
So global law to govern
When we are
nations.
successful,
And we will be.
we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can
Oxymoron
use
alert.
its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founder.
Yeah, so a credible UN is going to use their peacekeeping role. They talk about their military forces, the weirdos with the blue helmets, to bring about the vision of the UN's founders. Well, you had Stalin, his minion, Mr. Molotov, and then Alger Hiss represented us. We threw him in jail afterwards because he was a spy for Joseph Stalin. So here's Clinton.
After 1989, President Bush said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order.
Beijing Biden.
The affirmative task we have now.
See, I'm fully bipartisan.
Is to actually create a new world order.
An equal opportunity exposure. Now, what's the new world order going to look like? Right, you remember the 250 million Chinese slaves herded out of their farms and villages? Well, according to George Soros, who's putting more money into our political system than pretty much anybody else on the planet, he'll tell you what it's going to look like if they get their way.
We need a new world order that China has to be part of the process of creating it, and they have to buy in. They have to own it the same way as, let's say, the United States owns the Washington Consensus, the current order.
So the most murderous government in history has to own the new world order, according to the guy who is flooding our political process with lots of money. David Rockefeller echoed that in the 70s. Klaus Schwab agrees China's a role model.
Respect China's achievements, which are tremendous over the last over 40 years since the opening up and policy and reform policy came into action. I think it's a role model for many countries.
Yeah, the most murderous government in human history is a role model for many countries. All right, so the media is lying to you. And in the last couple minutes I have left here, I'm just going to share with you some ideas on what we do about this. I would encourage you to get involved in the political process. And I know you guys at RCAF are. There are some incredible legislators in here. I hope you will get to know them. Julie Auch, Senator Julie Frey-Mueller, Carla Lems, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some, but there are really some excellent people in this room who are on the front lines fighting for your freedom. If you won't run for office, support one of them. Find a candidate that you like that will do the right thing. Go knock on doors for them. Write them a check. It's hard to run a campaign, I know, but get involved. Get ready, because these weirdos are not going to stop until we are hungry and starving and fully dependent on them. If you can, try to get multiple streams of income so they can't control you. Make sure you've got a good network, and I think probably most of you do living in smaller agricultural towns, but make sure you're in a good church, you've got a good homeschool community, because as we saw during COVID, things can change really quickly. And we don't want to be the people at Walmart beating each other up over toilet paper, right? Much better to have a good network of friends that you can trust in case when things get bad. Turn off your TV. Like it's not even fake news anymore. It's like psychological terrorism masquerading as fake news. Just turn the thing out. Vaccinate your family against the next pandemic. Throw the thing out the window and be done with it. And by the way, they are planning that, the bird flu. They want to kill all your cows, kill all your chickens, rig the next election. You know how it goes. We've seen this movie before. You need good information, right? We're in a war, not because we want to. A war has been declared on us. And as anybody who's been in a war will tell you, if you don't have good intelligence, if you don't have good information, you might as well surrender because you're going to lose. So here are some good places that I recommend. I serve as senior editor for the New American Magazine. You can talk to my friend Leah in the back at the John Birch Society booth. It's a great, great publication. My website is libertysentinel.org. Write for a lot of publications. I also wrote the book Deep State, Invisible Government Behind the Scenes. You can get a copy of that from Leah. It kind of goes through who are these people, what tactics are they using to destroy our country. I would urge you in the strongest possible terms to protect your children. They are coming for your kids openly. They want to brainwash your children to believe that all of this that I've just exposed for you is a good idea. And if you don't take action to protect them, they will get them. So that's me and my family homeschooling at the beach. The Constitution is a great, great tool if we can use it. And to use it, we first have to know it. So, you know, every politician, every elected official, and government official takes an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. It'd be really good if the electorate knew the Constitution so we could hold them accountable. A lot of this stuff would stop in its tracks. State of South Dakota can stop a lot of this stuff in its tracks. We're doing it down in Florida. Certainly you guys can do it here. We need our state and our local governments to stand in the gap and say, sorry, Joe Biden, no, we are not going to let you shut down our farms. We are not going to let you shut down our power plants. We are not going to let you shut down our mines. We're not going to let you shut down our energy systems, because then we'll die or we'll end up as slaves. We are not going to accept it. And once we're done appealing to all of the human institutions, we do what our forefathers did. This is actually the flag many of them flew during the war for our independence. Appeal to heaven. Right? Once you get to the Supreme Court and you can't get justice there, you go to a higher court. This one trumps all of them. So we need to learn to say no. Go read Daniel chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego telling the king of Babylon, no, we will not bow down to your golden idol. And truly incredible what happened. Again, read Daniel chapter 3. That'll be your homework. And just want to leave you with this, folks. We're in a spiritual battle. It's not just a political or an economic battle. It's not just agricultural or energy. It's not just education. Ultimately, this is a battle against the forces of evil from the pit of hell. And we need to understand that if we want to stop them. The Apostle Paul explains in Ephesians 6:12, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. Right? George Soros, Bill Gates, the rest of the clown car, they could drop dead tomorrow, and Satan would raise up 10 more idiots to take their place. We're really up against the powers, the principalities, the rulers of the darkness of this world, and against the spiritual wickedness in high places. In Ephesians chapter 6, we read how we are to respond to this. You take the shield of faith. That's how you quench all the fiery darts of the wicked. And then you take the sword of the Spirit. That is the Word of God. That's your offensive weapon. Right? Oh, there are infinite genders. No, actually, God made them male and female. That's pretty simple. Right? And there's answers to all of these attacks on truth, decency, morality, and common sense. You just need to learn how to use your weapon. And then I've got bad news for the evildoers and good news for us. In Psalm 2, God actually talks about them. Turns out it's not a new problem, and there are prophetic implications to this. David writes 3,000 years ago, the kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers conspire together against the Lord and his anointed. You can imagine God's probably just terrified, right? Oh, no. The kings are conspiring against me. Whatsoever shall I do? Now, as you keep reading the psalm, you see where this is going. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. Okay, God ridicules them. God thinks these people are funny. And then in verse 5, we find out he's going to speak to them in his wrath. And you do not want to be on the wrong side of that. Trust me. So thank you guys so much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Shad, and everybody else. God bless you guys. Really appreciate you.